Welcome to the Coffee and Counseling Podcast, where two licensed psychotherapists give you their unfiltered opinions on mental health, wellness, life, and everything in between. It's real, raw, and ready to challenge what you think you know. Get ready for some tough love. Before we begin, just a brief disclaimer, this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and does not take the place of therapy. We hope you enjoy today's session. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session of Coffee and Counseling, where we don't spill the tea, but the coffee will be piping hot while we talk about all things counseling. We're your hosts, Rachel Steinhardt.
I'm Stephanie Schaick, and today we're diving into something that doesn't get talked about enough. What happens when your diagnosis or your coping strategies become your identity? And then what? What happens when you're not the sick one anymore, or when the ways that you used to use to cope stop serving you? So grab your coffee and let's get into it. Rachel, what's one high and one low for you from this week?
Okay. Low will definitely have to be my daughter getting sick, which is not the end of the world because our kids and toddlers get sick all the time. But I felt so bad because she missed this birthday party that she was like counting down to go to for a little one.
Oh, that's so
sad. The whole entire day that she spent at the doctor's office, she just kept asking when she's going to this party. And I kept trying to explain to her that she's not going. And it was so heartbreaking.
That is so heartbreaking. Oh my gosh.
So heartbreaking. But I guess weirdly enough, I guess I don't really get this a lot because I have 3 kids that are so young and I'm constantly watching them together at the same time. And my attention is very split, but I am more of like the overprotective mama. So even though the next day, thank goodness, her fever was gone, I kept her home from camp because I'm not the kind of mom that sends their child like to camp or school when they're sick or when they're just getting better, or like shooting them up with pills and then sending them to school and camp. Moms that do that, dads that do that, whatever.
Yes, then don't get everyone else sick.
I do that. I may or may not have an issue with you. But I kept her home. And because she ended up being totally fine that day, we just had such a nice day together. And it was so cute because I never get that like more of like one-on-one time with her. And it was really sweet. Like I just had the day because my youngest one is also a girl. So it was like me and my girls. And it was very sweet. Like we don't really ever get that because my son is always with us, which God bless him. I love him. But it was just a different dynamic. And it was a very cute day. We like played in these brand new sprinklers. I bought them and colored. And she really enjoyed that extra special attention. So it was really nice.
That's so sweet. So a little bit of a silver lining to her being sick.
Yeah. How about you, Steph? How's your week?
So a low that I have, which was so annoying to me this week. It all started with me making vegetable lasagna, which by the way was amazing. But I guess at some point when I was cutting the veggies, I cut my finger, and of course it's like the pointer, and like it's like one. It's one of those that no matter what you do, it doesn't heal because you're always touching something and all of that. And then
that's my thumbs, by the way. My thumbs are completely covered in cut marks from how much I slice stuff. And like also, I don't know if this is the Sephardi in me. We like use our hands as the cutting board. So like we just take vegetables and go like this. Yeah, we don't. I mean, obviously I use cutting boards sometimes. So sometimes we're like too lazy or we're not in the mood and we just go like.
Oh my gosh, that's wild to me because I'm such a klutz that I would 100% be in the hospital if I tried to do that.
Yeah, so please don't try that at home, kids. Unless you don't a trained Sephardi since you were a child, please don't try that at home.
Yeah, PSA, definitely don't. But yeah, so like, and it's so frustrating. You know me, Rachel. Every time, like if I go out afterwards, I'm always like using hand sanitizer, and every single time you forget that it's there, and then it burns to no.
Oh my gosh, that is the worst feeling.
It's so annoying. And I was trying to avoid it, but then I'm like, that's probably the most important place to get if you are cleaning your hands. Like if there's an open wound, that's where it's most important. So it's starting to finally heal, but that was super annoying for the last few days. So I would put that in a low. And a high that I have is, I'm so grateful for this. I don't think I told you this, Rachel. I have been trying to pick out a paint color for my house for months now.
Oh my gosh, I have to hear this.
Yeah. So I originally was going to leave it white, but it just no matter what I do with it, it just keeps looking blank. So, and I really love the white, but it's just too much white. So I'm like, all right, I need to figure out a paint color, and it's been a hard time trying to figure it out because I need
Journey.
it's such a journey because I need to see it. I'm a very visual person. I can't kind of envision the space without it. So I told the folks at Home Depot to cut me off and no longer serve me because I swear I've spent more money on samples than I would be spending on the paint itself. I'm like, you guys
Of
have
course.
to stop me. But I finally, and it was so funny. It was like a throwaway color. I'm like, this is a color I hear recommended. Let me get the shade above it too, just in case. And I did, and that is a color that I'm getting because
Well, what color is it?
I was between because I kind of wanted like almost like not yellow, but like a yellowy, like a fancy hotel type of yellowy tint. But a lot of people talk me out of it, and they're like, gray is really the way to go. It's very versatile, but every color that I had, it was not consistent. So I was trying to see it in the daylight. I was trying to see it at night with the lights on, and it would change. I'm like, it's too dark now. It's too light now. So this seems to be steady. So I am not questioning myself anymore, and I'm going to bite the bullet and then get it. And I'm so relieved because that was so annoying to try to figure out. It was like decision fatigue, analysis paralysis, all the things.
I can't believe you haven't told me about this yet. I'm in shock.
I think that I was like so avoidant of it because I'm like, I can't think about it anymore. And I keep walking out. Every time I walk out of this room, I have all these samples on the wall and I keep looking at it and I'm like, I can't think about it anymore.
Yeah, you're gonna make yourself crazy. Okay, well, I'm happy that you picked something.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm very happy as well. So let's talk about why we wanted to cover this topic. It really sheds light on a rarely discussed part of healing. So not only can your diagnosis become a part of your identity, but also recovery can become a part of your identity, and the emotional fallout of recovery can lead to some struggles as well, because if your diagnosis or recovery has been front and center, it can really create fear, resistance, even self-sabotage to deal with the loss of identity that you might be experiencing as a result of your recovery. So by talking about this, we are hoping to normalize those identity struggles that come with recovery, because I don't think a lot of people are prepared for it or recognize that it's a big part of recovery. And so we're hoping people will feel a little less alone and understand the messiness in between the healing.
Okay, so let's just get into the basics. So, first of all, really quickly for whoever doesn't really know technically and broken down, what is a diagnosis? So, a diagnosis, simply put, is a mental health name. A diagnosis is a name that is given to an illness or a disorder after a clinical assessment is made, which helps identify and treat the mental health condition. The process involves a psychiatric evaluation. Sometimes it can be an evaluation made by a licensed clinician, a psychologist. That includes a review of symptoms, medical history, and a discussion of how the symptoms impact your daily life. The mental health diagnosis is made using different interviews, asking clients about their symptoms, their experiences, utilizing an intake. Sometimes there are different things noticed within a session or within an assessment, like behaviors, certain things that may be said, certain things that the professional might notice in terms of even things like hygiene. This can go into also testing, so we're talking about assessment. This can be actual questionnaires or rating scales that a professional may give to help create a diagnosis. There could be various cognitive evaluations to assess the client's ability to think clearly, to recall information, to use mental reasoning. And the professional assessing you also could use their own experience in addition to the DSM to determine a proper diagnosis. And this can really be important for several different reasons. It can really help the client and the therapist gain an understanding, and by the way, also the client's loved ones gain an understanding of the client's symptoms and why this is going on, what's going on, and help select the appropriate treatment and, create a plan in terms of how to move forward from there. It can also help insurance determine what kind of care the patient needs and gives the clients the ability to get the treatment coverage that they need. It may also help a patient qualify for Social Security or disability support or job protection under the Americans with Disability Act. And it could be a starting point for learning more about the mental illness. Now, a diagnosis can be really validating to people. It can explain things and give a language to your experience. And it could also reduce a lot of shame around what you or this person may be going through. But it can also become a label that you are over identifying with. It becomes just fully who you are. Like, I am anxious, I am depressed, I am bipolar, instead of saying, I'm someone that struggles with anxiety, or I've learned to manage my OCD, or I have lived through PTSD. It's not something, it becomes, instead of saying this is something that I've experienced or something I am experiencing or something that I'm living with, we're saying this is fully who I am, and everything else is secondary to that, which is truly problematic. Um,
Language
and
is so powerful, and it could really um, basically just put you in a box.
yeah, yeah, and what happens also when we're over identifying ourselves with it, and this is really what we're going to be spending the rest of this episode talking about, is like, how do you get away from that, and how do you come out of that, and who are you when you come out of that?
Mhm.
And this also can become really dangerous when a diagnosis of whatever the issue is, it becomes an excuse for bad behavior. The diagnosis can create like a placebo effect of exacerbated symptoms, and starting to utilize every single thing that you do under the sun as, proof of your diagnosis or an excuse for why you're acting a certain way. A diagnosis can become really like a, a, a a misguided way of leading you through life potentially, especially if you've been misdiagnosed, if you are looking at it as like your whole world. You're kind of like, well, I have this, so I can no longer do this, or I struggle with this, so I can't talk to this person, or I can't do this job because this is part of my life. And the whole identifying yourself as the diagnosis can just become the end all be all of your world and the center of your universe. And there's a time and a place, and it's something that can be really helpful and really create a lot of clarity. And it can also be something that's very problematic and dangerous and scary.
Mhm.
Um, you really need to ask yourself, like, how much of your sense of has been wrapped up in your diagnosis, and is there safety in being the person who's always struggling? Does healing feel like a loss of belonging? And for those of you, this is one of those, like, if you know things. I know Steph and I have had a lot of clients, also clients that we've shared, who've truly found a safety net in identifying themselves as the sick patient. They've created comforts with it. And, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but it's something to really look deep and ask yourself that hard question. Am I not wanting to let go of this part? Am I not wanting to identify myself with anything aside from this diagnosis because it's serving me in some way?
Yeah, and a lot of times, if you are struggling in certain ways, it could be where a lot of people are tending to you, or maybe making it easier for you, or separate of how other people might or may not be treating you, where you feel like you fit into this identity. It could be just a source of protection for yourself, where I'm untouchable because you can't insult me because I'm struggling with this, or it makes it easier for you to perhaps not necessarily do the things that you need to do, or that you want to do, because you might be hiding in effect behind the diagnosis. And that's not something that makes you a bad person or weak or anything like that. It's just sometimes part of the struggles, and it's something that you can absolutely work through in recovery, in treatment. So I want to talk a little bit about what it means and how it might look like for a person to become overly identifying with their diagnosis. So, like I said, it might be pretty self limiting where you're not living life to the fullest. You're not doing the things that you want to do or that you have to do. You might feel like you're a victim of your diagnosis where you feel stuck, unable to move forward, because sometimes that label, it's like the self-fulfilling prophecy in a way where it's like if I am a depressed person, then i'm I'm going to do depressed things. I'm not going to do the things that a non-depressed person would do. And it could be very hard to get out of that cycle, because it's a story that you're telling yourself, and you might really fall into the category where, or fall into the identity in the box where it's really hard to get out of that. And you might be a little reluctant to change, and that is something that could be totally normal with different diagnoses, such as there's different levels of motivation, and you can look this up on your own, like pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation. And sometimes we are hesitant to be motivated to move forward in our recovery. And I would encourage you, if you're interested, definitely look more into that. You might feel scared to heal, because what does it mean to be on the other side of this? If, especially if you've identified with this for a very long time, perhaps you've struggled with a diagnosis for a very long time, or you're very young and your formative years. And I see this a lot with my college age clients, or even high school aged, or younger for that matter, that this is really what you know. And for the formative years of your life, you might have been stuck behind this disorder. So it's really scary, because, like, who am I without this? You haven't really had a chance to explore or live your life outside of your diagnosis. You might be afraid to lose support, the people around you, or your therapist, your helping professionals that you might be having. If you are no longer sick, if that's the way that you're labeling your diagnosis, or you're putting that under the category of being sick or ill or whatnot, you might feel as though if you recover, then why would these people continue to tend to me or continue to treat me? It can also feel that if you are finally in a place of healing, it could be an invalidating part where you might feel that, did I even struggle at all? Was I really in a bad place, or did I make that up? And that could be part of your disorder, and trying to understand whether or not it was a real thing, or if you were exaggerating it. And sometimes we build a personality around our disorder. So in different disorders, we see this with like orthorexia. It's technically not a diagnosis in the DSM, but it's still just as important that as other eating disorders. It is where you are having a struggle with rigidity around food, and normally it is a pursuit of healthy eating, quote unquote, and that could become its own personality. And that's just one example that it might show up. But creating a personality around the diagnosis and the struggles can make it really hard to get out of that. So that's another way that you might have your identity wrapped up in the diagnosis.
Okay, guys, so let's talk about how to live with a diagnosis without it becoming an identity. Because all we're talking about is it's going to become your identity, or it can, or it has.
Yeah.
How do you hear a diagnosis, recognize that you have this thing that you need to overcome, that you're dealing with, that you're learning how to manage, and have it not become the essence of your life? So, first of all, we're going to learn to understand that this is an obstacle you learn to manage, to live with, or to heal from in your life. It is not your personality. It is not your character trait. It is not your hobby. And it is not your belief system or who you are. The goal is to overcome it and either learn to recover or learn to manage it. The goal is not to become its best friend and invite it to move in to all the areas of your life. We want to actively work on catching ourselves in these symptoms and make the appropriate changes, holding ourselves accountable, asking our families, our loved ones to hold ourselves accountable, and to make sure that we're not finding ourselves using it as an excuse in our daily life. Now, let's talk about what that means for a moment. If, for example, I am struggling with anxiety, and for whatever reason, I'm recognizing physical symptoms of anxiety over something that doesn't constitute that level of anxiety. It's okay to have that insight and say, okay, I am experiencing these feelings right now because I tend to deal with an anxious mind. And so I'm recognizing that right now I'm feeling this because I'm experiencing anxiety, not because I'm actually in danger. So let me tend to my anxiety symptoms instead of saying, oh, well, I have an anxiety disorder. So now I'm stressed out. And so let me take the next 3 hours off because I can't deal with anything because I have anxiety. That's the difference between holding yourself accountable and using it as an excuse. Using it as an excuse doesn't mean, sorry, to not use it as an excuse doesn't mean that you're not allowed to point it out or that you're not allowed to recognize it. It's very good to point it out and recognize it. That helps you take control of it. That helps you learn to manage it and gain control of your own life. But what we don't want to do is say, well, I have anxiety, so oh well, this is what the day is going to look like now. Like,
Mhm.
no, you can learn the proper tools, the proper skills, gain the insight in yourself so that you can say, oh, this is what's happening for me. This is why it's happening to me. And now I have the proper toolbox to know how to overcome this moment. And hopefully, also with that, depending on what you're diagnosed with, some of even the automatic reactions will change with time as you continue practicing this and the level of insight grows and you practicing the tools and creating certain lifestyle changes that help you stay at a certain level of mental wellness, you will see the symptoms in general of whatever your diagnosis is lessen. So that's what really the goal is. And hopefully, that's the goal for yourself. That's the goal you should want for yourself.
Mhm. And if anyone is curious to learn a little bit more about this, we definitely would encourage you to go and check out one of our more recent episodes about mental health and accountability. I believe it was titled something about mental health not being an excuse, but we'll link it in the show notes. It's something that it's really important to check out. And also, I wanted to just put out a caveat when it comes to, or an exception rather, when it comes to identifying with your diagnosis. What we see is that it is actually important to identify that in addiction. So if you are struggling with alcoholism or drug addiction, a lot of times the treatment does encourage you to label yourself as an addict, and that is part of that type of treatment plan.
Mhm.
So that doesn't mean you have to be a victim of it your entire life. However, it is a little bit of a nuanced discussion when it comes to that. So I did just want to point that out and not override that part of that recovery system.
Such an important point, Steph. And I also want to point out, for those of you, we talked about feeling this sense of safety and security with the identity of being the sick one and
Mhm.
certain things that come with that. For those of you who've experienced this, and I am specifically saying this because Stephanie and I have been in sessions and in group sessions where we've heard clients say this, you're not crazy for feeling that way. I think that it comes from a real and valid place. There are certain levels of attention and support given to people who are identified as a certain level of sick, of unwell. You're not making that up. I think it's very true. And not to make this conversation at all about this, but it's actually something very similar that people experience when they're pregnant. It's like, oh, you have another life in you. Now, all of a sudden, you are a more important human. You're like, people will stand up for you and people will let you cut them and people will help you more and people will be nicer to you. It's like your life matters more now because you're carrying another life. And whether or not that's true is a completely different conversation. But my point is like that feeling of creating an identity with how you are treated in a certain situation and I'm just giving the pregnancy example because that's something I can really empathize with, is, you know, being scared of like, okay, well, when this ends, then how's everyone going to treat me? Am I going to matter this much? Am I going to be this supported? Are people still going to be this nice to me? That's very valid. I just, I just want to take a moment to just express some compassion and like, I get that. And Stephanie gets that. It is scary, especially for those of you who've been suffering with an illness for years. And it's like all you know, and you've been in a higher level of care for a long time. And you're now coming down from it, or you're getting to the stages where you're in less intensive care, and it's potentially scary. Like, what is this going to look like for me? Is
Mhm.
anyone still going to care if I'm not suffering at this level? Do I need to keep making myself this sick for someone to see me, for someone to hear me? And my answer to you is, number one, it doesn't have to be that way, because you are allowed to ask for all the help and all the support, even if you're not that sick. And the other part of it is like, yes, there's certain levels of support and attention that comes with being that sick, but there's also a lot of freedoms that are removed from your life. There's also a lot of things that you lose. There's a lot of happiness that's removed, and there's a lot of opportunities and events and situations and moments, and you lose so much of life. So yeah, you gain some extra attention. I'm not going to lie to you. You gain a little bit of extra support, but what are you losing in that process? So
Mhm.
instead of focusing only on like what you're going to lose when you're shaking off an identity of a diagnosis, I want you to think about what you're going to gain when you become someone outside of just your diagnosis. And it's
Mhm.
just something I really want to make note of, because I know Steph and I are very much coming from a tough love type of
Mhm.
attitude, and we stand by that. We love the
Mhm.
tough love, but I always say, we say there's a time and a space for all of the things, and I just wanted to give a moment to just recognize that is a valid thing, and we see you and we hear you. We understand where that fear comes from. But like
Mhm.
I said with other things, like, be more scared of living a life where your diagnosis is your whole world.
Mhm. It's all about balance and leaving space for both the very real feelings, even when they might be hurting you, and then finding also ways to overcome them. And you will all probably get sick of hearing me say the word balance if you are continuing to listen to our podcast, and I hope you do. But a lot comes down to balance. So shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about when coping in and of itself starts to become its own issue. So, for some disorders, it actually has stemmed from a coping mechanism. So, for specifically when it comes to eating disorders or alcohol or addiction disorders, we often see that this happens because they don't normally develop on their own. Normally, they start off as ways that you are trying to cope with something else, and then they develop into its animal in and of itself, which particularly makes those types of disorders a bit more difficult and takes a little bit more time to treat. When it comes to coping, we have a desire as human beings to try to make ourselves feel better. And sometimes we go to adaptive and healthy coping mechanism, and other times we turn to not so healthy coping mechanisms. So if you are struggling with depression, or you just broke up with someone or lost a job, those are all things that are very real struggles. Perhaps you turn to going for a bike ride because going out and biking in nature makes you feel good. Perhaps you turn to journaling, and I hope that those are some of the things that you do turn to. But sometimes you might turn to going to the bar and drinking because that helps you to forget a little bit. Sometimes you go to food and say, well, this is the only thing I can control. I can't control whether or not I have my job. I can control my food. And then, as you could tell, it could become its own disorder. I'm not saying that those that you can't sometimes turn to food as a coping mechanism, or if you're not struggling with alcoholism or drug addiction, some people might have a glass of wine or a bottle of beer to help alleviate some emotions. And it's okay every so often to have that, as long as you're not struggling with it on a deeper level. But
Right.
it has to be part of a much more robust coping system. It can't be your only method to cope. And
Right.
one of the things I always say, just like when it comes to finances, we want to diversify. The more diversity you have in your coping mechanisms, and what I mean by that, it's if you have ways to cope when it's cold outside, if you have ways to cope when you're outside and you're running from place to place, when you're at school, you need to have coping mechanisms that can work when you're in different states emotionally and also physically, wherever you are, and what type of time of day it is. It might all affect the way that you cope. So when we talk about how eating or controlling your food, or going to food for comfort, or going to compulsive exercise, or going to alcohol, all of those things that could become its own disorder that can uh, become a real problem, where you end up stuck in that and then having another thing to have to deal with. Not only are you dealing with the underlying things that got you to that point, but also this new problem that you have. And
Yeah.
sometimes the coping becomes another identity in and of itself. Like, if you are always seeking a way to find control, then maybe you find an identity with that. Like, I always have everything under control, or you try to fix everything. That's another way that you try to cope. And then you become the fixer. Those are all the ways that it can be really easy for that to turn into its own identity. So it's
Mhm.
important to ask yourself, when you are analyzing this, you got to give yourself permission to recognize that maybe a coping mechanism was effective in some way, but it could have ended up hurting you, and creating space so that you can recognize that that is a problem. You can also see that it was helpful. And unfortunately, it seems to be taboo to say, yes, drinking helped me, or yes, binging at night helped me, or yes, compulsive exercise helped me, or whatever it is. Yes, staying in my bed all day and not doing anything helped me. But it might have created, it helped you in some way, probably, which is why you went to that method as a method of coping. But it's okay to recognize that while it has helped you or it served you in some way, that it is harming you as well. And that while it helped you in the past, we need to find alternative ways to cope that are more adaptive and healthy. So we can validate the past usefulness of the coping mechanism, and also simultaneously create space to let it go.
Mhm.
And that's, again, diversify and having other coping mechanisms in your toolbox. It's unfortunate because sometimes those are not as effective as the chemical reactions that you might get with alcohol or drugs or using food, but it'll be much more lasting and healthy for you in the long run, both mentally and physically.
Right. And by the way, guys, just I mean, first of all, I know there are so many addictions. There's shopping addictions, there's there's all kinds of addictions in this world, unfortunately. And everything that Steph is saying is meant to discuss, to touch upon all of the addictions. First
Mhm.
of all, even if they were not mentioned, and second of all, rule of thumb: when you are turning to something that generally has an addictive quality associated with it, most of the time there is like an addiction diagnosis associated with it. Be very careful to turn to that thing when you're in a bad headspace. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. It's one thing to have a glass of wine to like maybe unwind, or, to enjoy with your friends. It's one thing to, let's say, with the food, you're like, we want to enjoy and go celebrate and get a bunch of ice cream and pizza and whatever foods that make you feel happy. I'm saying that because I love those foods.
Who doesn't?
like having, you're having, you had like a stressful day or whatever, and you just kind of want to treat yourself and go to the mall and pick something up that's nice and whatever it is. There is a difference between that and truly like not being in a good headspace and saying like, I need to drink this off, or like
Point.
I am going to like not eat so that I don't feel this, or eat until I can't feel anything, or I'm going to go to the mall and like buy my feelings away until I'm no longer upset about whatever I'm upset about. Just thinking about the intention behind why you're doing what you're about to do, especially when it's something for a negative reason versus a positive reason, that for a lot of people is how the addiction starts, because it becomes, like Steph said, a coping tool. It becomes like your escape. And it also becomes very hard to find anything else as, I would say, like
Powerful.
fast acting as an escape as that. Like, that's one of the reasons that addiction is such a hard thing to overcome, because when you're learning to come out of it, there are very few things, if anything, that's going to give you the type of relief and escape and, just forgetting about the universe as that addictive activity did for you.
Yeah.
It's very, very hard. So just be insightful, be aware of what you're doing and why you're doing what you're doing. And like, I always tell people, if you're really not okay, it might not be the night to go out drinking with your friends. Like
Mhm.
that might not be the night to turn to alcohol, even if you don't have a problem with alcohol.
Mhm.
Try sitting down and painting. You know what I mean? Like
Yes.
try expressing your feelings in a different way, because at the end of the day, like a lot of people who are now living with an addictive trait or addiction disorder, they did not see that coming. They were not planning for it. And so all of us really just have to hold ourselves accountable to what we're turning to give us comfort.
Mhm. Those are
And I
such good
felt,
points.
yeah, it's scary. And I think, a lot of us, we don't really think twice about it. We're like, oh, whatever. I had a hard day at work. Let me go like to the bar friends. And I'm not saying you can't do that. I'm
Mhm.
just saying know yourself and know your limits and know, again, the intention behind why you're
Mhm.
doing what you're doing, because that in itself will answer a lot for you.
Yeah, and it's just about being aware and honest. And when you're aware of it, then it gives you a good insight as to what to do next.
Right. And so then there's a whole process in shaking ourselves off of this identity. There's this like identity crisis when we're healing from our diagnosis. And there's really this like grief of losing this part of us. Even when we realize that this part of us is not helpful or not healthy. I know that Steph and I have done this one in a million thousand times, where we have our clients who suffer from eating disorders write a eulogy, write a goodbye letter, write whatever form of creative writing you could think of to try and work through the feelings of ridding themselves of the symptoms, of the behaviors, of the disorder itself, of getting themselves to a higher level. And it really is a very, very hard exercise for our clients to do. It's a very hard homework. A lot of the times they do multiple versions of it. They do it multiple times in different parts of their recovery. But for someone who is struggling with shaking off a diagnosis as their entire identity, this is such a helpful skill. Writing a goodbye letter to it, writing a thank you letter to it,
Mhm.
writing a eulogy, recognizing that at one point this thing serviced you, it helped you, maybe it even protected you to a certain degree, but it's no longer doing that. And I think that that's where we have a hard time shaking off that identity. Is part of that is the hard truth of recognizing, okay, this is now more harmful than it is helpful. So then there's this other point of the quote unquote being in recovery. And that in itself still provides a label. So what about when you're past the crisis point, but you're still in recovery, like, then what? Then who am I? And if anything, this is just another point as to why this should not be the end all be all of your life. Because if you're not identifying with this diagnosis, then it doesn't matter if you're like the beginning of recovery, the end of recovery. That's just a part of your life that you're dealing with. And then you have this array of different parts of you, of your thoughts and opinions and beliefs and likes and hobbies and talents that make up who you are. And it doesn't matter like what point in the therapeutic process or in the healing process you are in. It doesn't have to mean anything that, oh, well, now you're in the recovery space, but you're in this part of it versus that part of it. It really doesn't matter. And I
Mhm.
want you to work on asking yourself, like, who are you outside of like, this is what I say to my clients all the time. I want you to pretend that this diagnosis never existed. Write me an entire description, a resume, a letter of who you are, and you are not allowed one time to mention anything regarding this mental health struggle.
Mhm.
And it's just a really helpful tool to help you kind of go on a date with yourself and figure out who are you outside of this and what do you have to offer the world outside of this, and who do you want to become and who do you want to be and who are you. And it's just, you just have so much more to offer than just your diagnosis. And
Mhm.
it's just such an important thing to keep in mind. But there is this fear that without the struggle of your mental illness, without the diagnosis, that, and this might sound weird to some, but some people do fear that without it, they won't be special anymore, or they won't be understood, or they won't be maybe connected to a certain group of people or seen in a certain light. And this is really, I'm sure there's so much to say regarding those points, but this is something I always try to focus on with clients. You can still be part of that group, but you could be on the recovery part of it instead of the sick part of it.
Mhm.
So you could be the person on the other side saying, I know how you feel. I know what that's like. I've been there and I made it to the other side. Like, wouldn't you rather be the inspiring story than the story looking for inspiration? So think about that when you're scared to come outside of that group and walk outside that door and say, what is for me on the other side? Because I do think people get really scared what's waiting for them. Um, on the other side, especially, like what the expectations in life are. If you're identifying with this diagnosis or this illness, you might say to yourself, well, people recognize that I may slip up here, or I can only do this much, or I may have hard days because I have this and this and this illness. If this is no longer part of who I am, what kind of things are people going to expect of me? I mean, do I have to be superhuman? It's scary. It's like, is there room for error outside the world of having a diagnosis? And here is the secret. Yes. Yes, because even those of us who don't have a DSM diagnosis, we make mistakes and we have bad days and we're cranky and we mess up and we do silly things and we say dumb things and we sent the wrong email and we had a bad tone and all the things. And we don't have to look at a diagnosis and say that's why. We just say, look, we're humans and this is part of the human experience and that's why. But part of being on the other side of a diagnosis is saying, but I'm in a place where I can hold myself accountable and I'm in a place where I can do better next time and I'm in a place where I can take responsibility for my actions or apologize or whatever needs to happen after you did whatever you did. And then there's this question of like, will people still check in on me if I'm not the one who's falling apart? Well, here's the thing. You may not believe this, but you might not need people to check in on you that much. You might enjoy some independence and some freedom. And here's the other wonderful part. When you're in that well and healthy space, you have enough love and respect for yourself and wellness and confidence to be able to reach out when you do need support,
Mhm.
and you can ask for help, and people will enjoy checking in on you because they're not just calling you for a wellness check. They're calling you just because they want to see how you are, because they miss you, because you're awesome. And
Mhm.
it's so great because you get this love and support and attention, but it's a different version of it. And it's wonderful because you don't just have to be a patient for someone to be there for you.
I often find that I reach this point with my clients where there's almost like an existential crisis when we're at a place of recovery where it's like, okay, I'm really doing much better than where I started. And sometimes I see that there's an anger that happens toward, especially in eating disorder or eating disorders, an anger that happens toward the eating disorder, and an anger that I've lost all this time in my life. I don't know who I am. And I think it's a really great place to be, by the way, if you are experiencing this. And it's a good thing to process, and understanding that that anger is a good thing because we're letting it go and we're grieving, and anger can be a part of grieving for sure. And when we say, okay, I'm angry toward this, we can recognize it served a purpose. We can work on letting it go, but we can also have some appreciation, not only for how it served you, but also that a lot of times when you go through something, it forces you to do self exploration and learn a lot of tools that you wouldn't have otherwise learned if you hadn't gone through something. Now, of course, I would love to have all my clients never have needed therapy and never have been in a place where they are struggling so greatly. However, that is where they are. And a lot of times you could come out the other side and have such a better and deeper understanding of yourself than people who have not gone to therapy. Have a lot of really great tools to be able to have successful relationships. And we can look at it as an opportunity to say, who am I? Who do I want to be? What am I interested in? What are my values? And you could say, oh, it's so upsetting that I didn't know this. But actually, it could be a blank canvas. It's a lot of perspective, and it's hard to make that shift. But I would encourage you to try to make that shift and ask yourself, what can I be? Who do I want to be? It's not about becoming normal, quote unquote, because what the heck does that even mean? And who is really normal? Because we can't really have a definition of that. It's about creating space for a fuller self and a fuller life. And letting go of that sick role does not mean that you weren't struggling. It doesn't mean that you weren't worthy of support. It just means that that was a place in your life and a role in your life that served a purpose that you no longer need. So if you are at this place where you're struggling in this way, I would encourage you to ask yourself, like, who are you beyond this diagnosis? And what did the coping strategies that perhaps you identified with or became a little bit too personal to you, or that it became part of your identity, what did it give you? And how can you find and meet your need in healthier alternatives? And then build new reference points. Instead of asking yourself, like, am I healed? Ask, like, what am I creating next? What's next for me? And that could be a whole major shift in and of itself when you are working through and out of recovery in a place where now this is you.
So let's talk about some closing takeaways. So, your diagnosis, simply put, is information, it's not your whole identity. And coping strategies can help, but they aren't meant to be like permanent housing. So, also be careful which coping strategies you are utilizing. And healing may feel like a loss at first, but that's often the start of discovering a deeper and truer version of you. So it's just some things to keep in mind.
And then that brings us to our listener question. If you would like a chance for one of your questions to be featured in one of our next sessions, you can email us at coffeeandcounselingpodcast@gmail.com, or send in your questions to Instagram at Coffee and Counseling Podcast, which we also hope you're following us on. So here's today's listener's question. I always hear people talking about attachment styles. Is this really something I need to educate myself on?
I do think there's been a very large emphasis on attachment styles. I don't think it's like the end all be all of the universe and every relationship. However, I do think attachment styles are hugely important because they shape how we relate to other people, especially in close relationships,
Mm.
and how we regulate ourselves emotionally. So understanding your attachment style really gives you like a roadmap for healing and building healthier relationships, maybe breaking old patterns that may no longer serve you. Um, Having just a better understanding of that, whether you're secure, anxious, avoidant, disorganized, whatever, it affects how you handle intimacy, conflict, trust, emotional closeness. Um, it could shape your nervous system. Like a lot of it isn't just psychological; it's biological. Um, it can express itself in how safe you physically and mentally and emotionally feel in a relationship with another person. It can also affect your ability to self-soothe. It can help explain triggers and patterns. It can whether it helps with this or damages it, but it can recreate like early relational dynamics from childhood that a lot of the time can then pop itself up in present time, which many times could not be helpful. And the lack of understanding of that, you're just left confused and constantly frustrated. Um, and when you have an understanding and an insight of your attachment, it really can offer you just like a path of clarity and healthier relationships and better insight in yourself so that you can have a better understanding of your own needs, your fears, um, and just have a healthier relationship, not just with people, but with yourself and with life.
Mhm, mhm. So I would say that it's great to know and to have information, and information is power. So if you, especially if you're struggling in relationships, whatever type of relationships, it doesn't have to be necessarily romantic. It's a good idea to do a little bit more of a deep dive into understanding your attachment style, because it could give you a lot of information and insight as to
Mhm.
what you might be struggling with and why you're having these difficulties, and then how to overcome it. So that's where I would say is why it can be really helpful and how it can be important. But also, just like with anything, we need a balance. It doesn't inform your entire personality. It could be something that you are aware of and recognize, okay, I think I have an insecure attachment style because I'm in relationships and I could get very, very clingy, and everyone's telling me that I'm clingy, and I'm trying to work on that. That might be a situation where you're having an insecure attachment style. So if you understand that, and when you can understand yourself, have a greater awareness of yourself and how you operate, that could be really powerful. So I would say, especially if you struggle in relationships, do some research and try to identify that for yourself. But it could be helpful. It's not the be all and end all.
Right. I think it's very much connected to today's topic because
Yeah.
just like a diagnosis, if you start identifying with an attachment style, it can just become an excuse for why you do the things the way that you do. And I'm not going to repeat this entire episode, but you catch my drift. Like at the end of the day, you can use it to educate yourself and better yourself, or you can use it to, have a crutch essentially. And you decide what you want to do with that knowledge.
Mhm. And we probably should note that you can change your attachment style, although it's very, very difficult to get out of because a lot of times they are developed in childhood. You absolutely can with knowledge and awareness around it. And ideally, you want to get to a secure attachment style. Again, easier said than done, but it's good to have that information. So, we would encourage our listeners to reflect on this question. What parts of your identity have been shaped by struggle, and what do you want to reclaim or redefine as you grow? We ask that you send in questions or feedback or topic suggestions to us over on our Instagram at Coffee and Counseling Podcast, or email to coffeeandcounselingpodcast@gmail.com. Both of us offer individual therapy. So if you are interested in working with one of us, you can contact us for a free consultation call. And both of our contact information will be linked in the show notes, along with everything else that we had mentioned today that is relevant. We'll put that in the show notes as well. So thank you for joining us today. And we are looking forward and hoping that you see us again in our next session on Tuesday.
Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Please follow our Instagram at Coffee and Counseling Podcast and send any questions you have about any topic to us via direct message for a chance for your question be featured in one of our next sessions. You can also email us your questions or topic suggestions at coffeeandcounselingpodcast@gmail.com. Make sure to check out some of our other sessions available to you right now. Once you drink up all of those and your coffee, come back next Tuesday for our next session.
The information shared in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute therapy or mental health advice. Listening to this podcast does not establish a therapeutic relationship between you and the hosts. If you are in need of support, we encourage you to seek help from a qualified mental health professional. This podcast is not a substitute for individualized care. We do offer individualized therapy. If you're interested in individual therapy with one of us, please visit our practice website and send us an email to set up a free consultation call. All of the links and our contact info will be in the show notes.
That's great. I think that that's very important, and we probably should have done that from the beginning, so kudos to you. Kudos to I mean,